Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Virtual Roundtable, where we are commemorating the legacy of Louis Graham, who was not only one of the, I think, brightest research minds of his generation, one of the most curious, one of the most passionate, and one of the most committed individuals working in public health. We are convening this roundtable just to unpack his legacy, to celebrate him, and also hopefully offer blueprints and lessons learned to aspiring public health researchers, policy advocates, and practitioners. And I have the pleasure of being joined with two of Louis's colleagues who are going to share their perspectives on Louis as a researcher, as well as their perspective of him as a colleague and friend. And I have with me Bob and Bill. Would you like to introduce yourselves?
Sure. I'm Bob Aronson. I was on the faculty at UNC Greensboro while Louis was a doctoral student there. I go by he, him, and my role is I'm the director of public health at Elizabethtown College. So after Louis had graduated, a couple years later, I went to teaching undergraduate students because what I found the most joy in was mentoring the students I worked with, and Louis being chief among those.
Thanks, Charles. William Lopez. I go by Bill. I use he and him pronouns and él in Spanish. I'm a clinical assistant professor at the U of M School of Public Health. It's also where I got my doctoral degree while Louis was a postdoc at the University of Michigan. Charles described him as a colleague and friend, and that's exactly what I would say. He was one of my best friends and certainly a dear colleague and mentor. Also something lots of people don't know about him. He was also my neighbor. So not only did we work together, but we lived in condo complexes next door. So are familiar where he would walk his dog and some of the restaurants he ate at. I'll talk about that later. That not only I was honored to see how Louis was in my neighborhood brought this sense of creating spaces and neighborhoods and making neighbors everywhere he went.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. Thank you for that. So why don't we just jump right on in? Bob, I guess we'll start with you. If you wouldn't mind just sharing your, Louis's, professor advisor in his PhD program in his doctoral studies. When Louis came up to UNCG, University of North Carolina, Greensboro, as your student and colleague, what were your impressions of him? Like, could you describe the first meeting,
Sure.
the first time you met him?
I think Louis learned of me through Dr. Treadwell back in 2003 when she had a special issue of American Journal of Public Health on men's health. I have one of the articles in there. And so we had developed a connection over time. And I think my initial conversation was through email. I just can't remember if he made a visit in person or if we just had a conversation by email and phone. But initially, it was to talk about his interests, why he wanted to go on for a doctorate, what his research interests were, and I asked him to send me a draft of his statement that he would include in the application, and gave me a chance to read it. I also gave him feedback. I was always giving Louis feedback on writing because he has so much to say in very complicated sentences with many phrases. And I'm like, please be merciful to the reader. You can handle all of this in one sentence, but many people can't. So I was giving him a lot of feedback on how to write his statement. But it was still his statement, and he was very impressive. One of the things that I noticed, I've been doing work predominantly in African American communities for 30 some years. And one of the first things I can expect is that people aren't going to trust me. Why would they trust me? They shouldn't trust me based on experience. And but Louis, he was gentle and kind. I did not sense um, any distrust beyond what you would normally have meeting a new person. Um, and I think we both felt fairly at ease with one another. One of the things that was very clear from the very beginning is that he was a solid thinker. Uh, he had a great undergraduate program at Carleton, good liberal arts training. He was introduced to broad ways of thinking, and he came very well prepared. I think his experience at Morehouse also uh, kind of uh, strengthened what he came with. He had a great experience. He had experience in Atlanta and South Africa. Um, he had a wild story um, just from leaving Los Angeles to uh, the whole process that led him to Carleton was really intriguing. So I found this guy very interesting and actually very kind and very gentle. Uh, he looked very young. Um, that was in 2007, I guess, when he started the program. And yeah, I get the dates mixed up, but um, yet he had great experience. So I was just getting started with my CDC funded HIV prevention intervention with African American heterosexual males in college. And Louis was on board from day one. And so initially, he had an office separate from where I was, but we developed a suite for our project, and we were with each other all the time. So I got to know him quite well. So initial impressions: this guy is young. This guy is incredibly bright. He he thinks very deeply about things, and yet I felt like a lot of his thinking wasn't coming across because his writing was so difficult uh, to read. So I gave him a lot of feedback whenever we were writing things together. Um, yeah, go
And
ahead.
Bill, thank you so much, Bob, for that. And Bill, what about you? What was your first impression of Lewis?
Yeah, it's such a great question. I'm actually want to comment on something that Bob said. I never knew Lewis as I always knew Lewis as a great writer. So I probably met him a little bit later. So thank you for whatever, help you gave him with his writing. But one thing I do remember about Lewis is that when I would give him drafts to edit for me, they were always covered in red ink, whether it was real or digital red ink.
Yeah.
So he always had plenty to say about my writing, was always very generous with his time.
Mhm.
Just briefly, because I want to go back to the question of how we met. But I ultimately published a book from my dissertation that you can see back here on my shelf that Lewis largely contributed to, and I never got to give him a copy. I was very heartbroken about that because I think he would have
Mhm.
liked the section that he helped me work on. Um, so how did I meet him? Yeah, Charles, good question. So Lewis was working on a project at the University of Michigan that was later called Detroit Youth Passages Project. And this project was a collaboration of three different CBOs, community-based organizations in Detroit. So Ruth Ellis was one of them, and you'll meet Laura later, who was the director at the time. And then DHDC, Detroit Hispanic Development Corporation, and Alternatives for Girls. And I'll talk about more of these projects more as we go on. But But the very first time I met Louis, it was in his advisor and my advisor's office. And Mark Padilla, if you all know Mark, was our advisor. And so we were working with Ruthella's Center, and they were having a basketball game. And I'm not really a basketball player, but Mark's like, "Oh, this would be great. This would be a great part of the work to go get involved in the basketball game." And he's like, "Do you want to go?" And like, I'm a first year student. I mean, do I say no? Do I say yes? But he's like, "Why don't you go? Why don't you and Louis go?" And Louis was there in the office, and all I can remember is how enthusiastic he was to like, "Yeah, of course, let's go play basketball. This is of course what you would do as part of your community based research project."
Uh-huh.
Um, and that moment stuck with me for many reasons. For one, Louis didn't know me, and he welcomed all the time. We were driving back and forth to Detroit, so always actually supporting me and getting to the work. But also, he never really drew these firm dividing lines between what was research, what was being with the community, what was, if we use the word ethnography, right, what was ethnography, what was participatory action research. He just really lived his life. Like he wanted to make the world better, and he used whatever tools he had to do that, whether it was a method or whether it was compassion or whether it was basketball. He always made sure to do it.
Absolutely. Could you just talk? Could both of you just talk a bit more about Lewis's research interests? Like, what do you recall about what he was interested in as a researcher? And just how your collaborations sort of helped evolve his thinking, and how he evolved your thinking.
Sure.
Yeah, definitely. It's always both directions. And so I knew when Louis came in that he had a strong interest in issues related to mental health, especially with Black men, sexual minority men, and it expanded from there. Uh, he he had an orientation towards public health that it's kind of like Bill was just saying. It was all connected. He wasn't just about collecting data and analyzing it and getting manuscripts out. He was really about how can what he's doing impact and address disparities in psychosocial mental health issues among populations, and definitely always interested in understanding the context of people's lives and how it impacts them. So it's natural that he had a narrative approach. He definitely understood ethnography when he came in. I think he was less acquainted with community-based participatory research. I had been doing it since the early 90s before people started calling it that. And so even this approach to community-based participatory research also affects the teacher-student relationship. I was fully immersed in Freire, and students were actively engaged in the creation of knowledge, the understanding of knowledge, and so I think that fit really well with Louis and Louis's orientation. So it became natural that he engaged in community-based participatory research. I knew of the postdoc program since it started, so I encouraged him to look into that. And so there's too many things to say. I just have a hard time breaking it down. I've got, like I said, so many materials from Louis that are still on my computer. And his answers to questions for his preliminary oral exams, or first his written exams and his preliminary orals, incredible work. And I still have most of that, which is, almost sacred. You wonder what to do with it. Go ahead.
Yeah, sure. No, I think you're exactly right, Bob. That there's just so many different stories, so many different so much output, so much research output that Lewis produced. It's hard to know when to start. And usually when I don't know when to start, I'll try to like think back to a particular story that might capture, an example for me. And I think one, that kind of embodies Lewis's research well, is a conference that we went to that actually we didn't go to it. I went to it. He arranged it. So he arranged the conference in Detroit, and it was a social entrepreneurship conference. And, lots of people were like, I didn't know Lewis did entrepreneurial work. I didn't know Lewis did small business ideas or small businesses. And, largely that wasn't his field, but he saw it as a natural extension of the public health work he did. So, of course, that's where he went with it. And just to give you an idea of how we got there, how Lewis got there, right? So, as I mentioned, we were working on Detroit Youth Passages project. And this project focuses on multiple communities, right, who were who had exchanged sex for drugs or money. And this included Latinos at risk of gang violence. This included trans and LGBTQ folks who lived in Detroit. And this included women who had exchanged sex for money. And Lewis saw well, of course, this particular behavior is happening. There's many reasons it's happening. That's not what's important. What's also important is that folks have all kinds of options to bring in income, right? And should folks want to bring in income this way, that's an option. Should folks bring in income this way, let's make sure that's safe, right? He always had such an expansive way of thinking about these things. So one of them was well, let's start your small micro businesses. You're very good at preparing and doing hair and doing nails. Let's find a way to make this into your business, right? Or you're very good at, for example, creating t-shirts, graphic printing t-shirts. Let's find a way to make this into your business, right? So his public health mindset was always, how do we go from, our public health obsession, which what we think of as risk behavior, how do we stop focusing on that one piece of risk and think about how to enrich an entire life, right? How to provide opportunities for someone to grow as a person in all kinds of different ways. When I teach now social determinants of health, and I think Lewis would get a kick out of some of the things that I'm doing now, because I was definitely the student and he was the teacher. Now I'm getting to be a teacher. I kind of wish he was here to tell me what I could do better here too. But one of, I teach on I believe it's the United Nations definition of health, which is more than just the absence of disease, right? But the ability to thrive. And to me, Lewis's work embodied that definition far before I'd ever read it, right? He thought so little about the absence of disease and so much about the presence of fulfillment in people's lives. And then, his work continues to stay with me. I actually cite it all the time. I actually still put it in my in the syllabi and have my students read lots of the work he does too. And then, just to bring up what you said also, Bob, that Lewis he learned CBPR as he went on, which I also didn't know. I thought that's what he came to the field knowing about, because that's lots of what he taught me and taught me to do it very well. He was one of the original folks who taught me what it means to take part in a study from the ground up, to know what it means to understand the context in which behaviors occur.
Yeah, I remember us having a very we've had a lot of discussion. We had a lot of discussions about CBPR, and one of the things I also appreciated is that he also brought a lens around the relationship to whiteness of CBPR. I remember he definitely, I don't know if that was a lens he necessarily shared with y'all, but he was very clear that CBPR in many contexts was this. One had to also examine whiteness, and particularly, I think in his lens, particularly weighted certain white women were able to use CBPR in this way that wasn't always. So, I think there was always a rigor in his racial justice analysis, even in public health. And you see this, particularly with his engagement of critical race theory, which I think he was definitely on the vanguard of thinking through public health. And it was actually interesting. There's this conversation now around the carceral state and public health, and racism as a public health issue and things like that. And I wonder what he would make of that, because I think as we've shared some of his early thinking was kind of grappling with some of those things, some of those types of subjects.
Yeah, and Charles, one of the things that really pains me at times is I know he would have been on the cutting edge of lots of those
Oh
things.
yeah,
Like he said them way before they entered into the public lexicon, right? Like he taught me about critical race theory way before anybody was talking about it on the media. Certainly, bring it into public health.
Well,
Um,
what's funny? I was like this little black boy reading Foucault and trying to read a little race theory, a little critical race. And I remember I was like, "Oh, you're doing public health. Well, I'm doing, I read Discipline to Punish." And I think eventually, particularly early on, we had this kind of mind meld where I was like hardcore cultural studies and he was hardcore public health. And in a weird way, our thinking kind of merged. So now I'm more sympathetic. I used to be very dismissive. I mean, all due respect, I was very dismissive of public health research, particularly in the legacy of racism. And Lewis kind of helped me understand, particularly his rigor around, and I've said this before, but, one of, I think Lewis's great contributions to my life was just the importance of how we measure and how we assess mental health, particularly of Black folks. Because he was arguing like 15 years ago or however many years ago, that part of why particularly Black gay men are not assessed as being depressed or having anxiety is because the tools we use are flawed, that kind of rigor. And so, I mean, even thinking about like measurement tools and having a racial justice lens, and I mean, I know there are many conversations about that now, but in the context of psychosocial health, it just blew my mind.
right.
And those are the things that's how part of how he, I think, impacted my practice.
Yeah, he was exploring all these things while he was at UNCG, and so much of it was new to me. I was constantly learning from Lewis. I learned about critical race theory from Lewis, and then we he was in the second cohort of our program over there, and I co-taught the qualitative research methods class the first cohort with Tracy Nichols, and then the second cohort when Lewis joined that class, I did it by myself, and I was impressed. First of all, his understanding of the foundations behind all of the competing paradigms used in research and even in qualitative research. He came knowing as much as his professor. I constantly in, bringing into the discussions in class things that would challenge all of us. I'm sure he learned things too, but I know that I learned quite a bit from him. And when in addition to being a student, finishing a program in 3 years while he was there, he published multiple manuscripts. He did his dissertation research, which I'll talk about in a minute. He also wrote an Art 36 to NIH, trying to get funding for some of the work that he wanted to do. He taught classes. And he was well connected with students across campus. Plus, he worked on my project. He worked a lot on my project. Our project. I shouldn't call it my project. So for his dissertation, he was interested in depression and anxiety among Black queer men. He was interested in how we assess issues of measurement. So he was looking at, okay, the tools that we have right now are flawed. So he pulled together a group of experts on Black queer men and mental health issues and worked together identifying the tools that are out there and working on trying to adapt those. So we always had these conversations because people say you can't use tools, you have to use them directly as they've been tested because they have psychometric qualities and he and I were always talking about, but the context makes a huge difference. And people change, the language changes over time. And all these tools were created for a particular population, not this population. And so they worked on coming up with alternative language. They adapted some of these tools, and then he engaged clinicians to be the gold standard for assessing um, anxiety and depression in this population, and looked to the degree to which the uh, clinician's assessment matched what the tools would be saying. And so, an incredible and ambitious dissertation. He did a fabulous job. Um, there were plenty of doubters out there, um, but when it came to the end of the year assessment of how our doctoral students are doing, maybe I shouldn't say these things if they're going to, but I went off on people who did not believe this guy could do it, and he was probably the best student they ever turned out.
Say that again.
They were people that were opposed to even bringing him into the program, and
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. Is it with DRPH programs? Isn't it students usually are the preference is for students to have like work experience in between the MPH and the doctoral degree?
Now the DRPH has changed over time. I have a DRPH. When I finished at Johns Hopkins, 97, they actually came to me and said, which degree do you want right before graduation? Like, do you want the PhD or the SCD or the DRPH? And I'm like, I was always kind of a strong critic of the work that Johns Hopkins was doing. And I didn't want to be just like them. So I said, some of the people I respect in the field are DRPH. I'm going to go for that. And I also was situated at the intersection of research and practice, much like Louis. Louis even more so. Not just research, not just intervention, but policy, all of that. He was right at the intersection of that constantly. So I went down for 20 minutes highlighting his accomplishments during this program. And finally they said, okay, we get it. Yeah. So, yeah, he impacted me greatly. He impacted my colleague Regina greatly, and many of the students. So his impact is simultaneously personal and professional, simultaneously as just a genuine human being and an incredible thinker. And so, you can't really disconnect those. I was at APHA a couple years ago in Boston, and I stopped at the Amherst table, a woman I had never met before, and within minutes we were crying because he had touched us both. And, like I said, both personally and professionally.
I've highlighted this before, but it's also, I think, important to mention that Louis actually passed away before he was 40. So he accomplished all of this before he was even 40 years old.
Yeah.
Bill, would you like to share are there just other stories about how you think about his impact as a researcher, how you kind of recall those sorts of experiences?
Yeah. I think, Bob mentioned just how much he would blend the personal and the professional, and how much, you would bring just warmth and kindness. into the work that he did. And I didn't realize until later that I had been socialized into a very different kind of CBPR. So Charles, you brought up how he would kind of think about how CBPR looks, including many times that CBPR can be the thing of the office space or the meeting space, and not the thing of what's happening on the ground, right? And many different evolutions since it began. I'm very thankful for having it as a frame, but my CBPR socialization was through Louis. So what I learned about what it was came from seeing him. We would hang out at the park and hang out with people. As I mentioned, like he would offer to take me to the basketball game. We would, we spent so much time just in many of the spaces that were spaces in which research participants, right, were also frequenting. And I didn't realize until much later that wasn't typical of CBPR. That you're not often you're often counting on a kind of elected single representative of an organization or a community, and that model works for many reasons, right? But that was never quite Lewis's model. His was more like, who is the person who's least likely to end up in this room and at this table, and more so, who are the group of people who might be missed in this particular constellation, right? And that's where he would get most of his. That's where he would form his ideas, right? That's where he would figure out what was needed, not by a particular representative, but by all the people that an individual believed that they were representing. So it was later that I started having to, when I was teaching, kind of had to go backwards and realize, oh, wait, what is the CBPR theory? What are the CBPR readings? And because I'd always come into it with, this feminist critical race theory lens, and then had to go backward and see where it started so that I could teach that, so that I could bring everyone up to where, Louis eventually got many of us to. I'll share one more story about Louis had this proclivity to understand lots of different paradigms or models or theories, right? Critical race theory, sociological model, all of them, and use them in many different ways. But one of the things that I liked is that he never made data at service to the model. He tended to get his data and to learn about people's lives, and then to see what different models could bring to his understanding of the world, right? And so when I was writing, I wrote my first book on an immigration raid that happened pretty close to me, about 7 miles from the University of Michigan. And I did all these interviews with folks who were involved in this raid. And, I was telling Louis that, like, man, I don't know why, like, lots of the same things keep coming up in interviews. And this was, this particular case that everyone was talking about leche, about milk, right? I was like, Louis, this keeps coming up. What do you make of this, And he started joking with me, and he was like, oh, you're going to write la leche the leche literature, the milk literature, right? And he was like, well, tell me how it's coming up. And so I gave him some examples, right? And there was one story that after the raid, folks were so scared of being racially profiled, they wouldn't go to the store to buy leche, to buy milk, right? And then there was another story that an advocate said, like, yeah, milk is a luxury. You can turn on your tap, but if you can't leave, you're not going to go about your community. And then there was a final story where one of the mothers who was in the raid was so frightened after the raid that she was incapable of producing breast milk after that. She could no longer nurse her child, right? And Louis has, helped me think through this. Is like, yeah, this is the socio-ecological model, Bill. What you're seeing is individual, community, and structural level impacts. Your community used a different word. They use the word leche, but come on, you're smart enough to catch this, right? And so he really, like, walks me through how, like, communities, people, if you listen, will explain complicated, dense public health theory just in different words, just in different ways. And I always appreciated him for pushing me on that point too.
Thank you. Yeah, I think one of the things I learned about being a friend of Louis is that, whatever ego I had, I just had to let go because he was just extraordinary. And I always tell, like, no one probably believes me, but I was like, the reason why I'm so hardcore now is because of Louis. Like, he definitely, I was always a little serious, but, like, he definitely, I think we made each other better. What is it? Iron sharpens iron. Like, It was phenomenal. And I was just like a colleague that worked at a nonprofit. But going back to the CVPR point, there's a reason why. I mean, I don't even know how many papers I'm on, but there's a reason why, like, I'm on like at least a few papers with Louis, is because he insisted that even as I helped him, even as we like if I helped him collect data, if I helped him think through stuff, he would include me as a co-author. And of course, me as like a program coordinator at an HIV organization, I can't possibly appreciate or grasp what that means, because I'm like, but he saw, it's almost like he saw more for me than at times than I saw for myself. Like, he believed that I was deserving. And so now when I talk to researchers, I'm like, well, what do you mean that you don't use the folks you work with the community? They don't get to be co-authors on your peer review publications. And so, I mean, I give researchers such a hard time, because he said, just from a perspective of being a practitioner, just because he was like, to me, the gold standard of how you do that stuff.
Right. So you were socialized in it backwards too, Charles. You learned the way it should be, and then had to slowly learn the way it is.
Yeah, absolutely. We're getting close to time. Is there just a final point you would like to make, or a final story? I know, Bob, you had some thoughts about Louis and his dissertation process, but are there just any final thoughts that you want to share as we wrap up?
Well, I think one area where he profoundly impacted me was how he integrated cultural studies into his way of looking at public health issues and introducing me to critical race theory. Um, he also included me in that paper. And I think my role probably was cleaning up the language to make it easier for people to understand. Uh, but, I had been working for so long on issues related to anti racism well before I started to understand issues of whiteness. And I think Lewis was right there as I'm trying to grapple with my own whiteness and helping me see the dominant cultural uh, uh, privilege and discrimination, seeing how that impacts the way I have lived my life, how I see things, and trying to work through that. Lewis was the best tutor to help me think through some of those issues. And at that time, I was definitely involved with Jeannie Young's work in Greensboro on with the Greensboro Health Disparities Collaborative, the CBPR work we were doing, and Lewis went to some of those meetings, but he was also the person that I could process this with.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, I certainly miss him dearly, and think of him often, and just see in this conversation and the other conversations you've been having, Charles, of what a legacy he's left, what a wonderful legacy he's left. Um, I wish he could come guest lecture in my classes. I think students would be lucky to have him, and I think he'd say yes, and I think I would really enjoy that. When I was a student, or when I was a PhD student, he would teach. He used to do qualitative interview training and have me come in as a participant, and it was fun. And I would love to reverse the roles here and invite him to do the same. He knew my daughter, who's 15 now. I didn't know my son,
Mm-hmm.
and they would have both loved him. They would have both enjoyed being around him, walking his dog Sky for him. So yeah, I think of his legacy, and his spirit lives on, and the work that he does, and in the stories we tell our students, and in the stories I tell my family.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, I think the memory that's both really sad to me, but also really joyous, and this is like probably one of the last great stories that we had together before things shifted. I think he had just started at UM so he was, got the tenure track position, and I had just started my organization, the Counter Narrative Project.
Mm-hmm.
And, this is what we had been planning for years. Like,
Mm.
Louis was, driving the research, his research. I started this organization. This is what we had been planning for years. And we were finally at this moment. So we were at this, we had been invited to this convening at the Ford Foundation. So this is 2014, summer 2014. So we're in New York City at the Ford Foundation headquarters, and we're at this convening, and we're talking up the program officers, and we're sort of also making plans with each other. We're like, okay, this is what we're going to do. And we were strategizing, like we were ready to go. Like the wind was on our back. We just had this very, very, very bright path ahead of us. And just, destiny can be so cruel sometimes. Like right when we got to the point where we were ready to take off, you know, I guess Destiny had something else in mind. And certainly I continued on with the organization. I always say, even though I'm the founder of the Counternator Project, which is my organization, in so many ways, Louis is like a sort of co-founder, because he absolutely believed in me. Like he believed that I could create this organization. I could build this organization that focuses on narrative change and Black queer men, and like so many things that we have been passionate about. But with that, I do thank you both so much for sharing your stories and sharing your time and being so generous. And with that, again, we are all just really appreciative of the legacy of Louis, and we will continue to find ways to cherish him and to celebrate him and amplify his incredible impact.